Wait, what? Did you just read that title correctly? Is the Milspouse Mastermind Show really going away after 3 years and 199 episodes? If you're curious, then stay tuned because we're about to dig into all the juicy goodness. You, my friend, were made for more. More than the managing of schedules, keeping up with kiddos, and holding down the home front. Welcome to the Milspouse Mastermind Show, the podcast that empowers you to get unstuck and craft a life with more meaning and less overwhelm. I'm your host, Christine, seasoned military spouse, mom of 3, and your guide to designing a life you love and growing a purpose-fueled business as a military spouse. I believe you have something valuable to offer, and when you pursue the things that light your heart on fire, you trade frustration for fulfillment and isolation for a life of impact. It's time to discover who you are meant to be, because together we can change the world. First off, if this is your first time listening, I am so glad that you are here. You picked a great episode to start with because I'm going to give you a little background on the podcast and then tell you what's coming next for me and for this show. So let's rewind about 5 years ago. I had just moved into our 5th home in 5 years. We had lived in 4 states and I had just given birth, and I now had 3 kids under the age of 4. I was not doing fantastic. I felt a little lost as a military spouse, but 3 things were happening for me at the time. Number 1, I was really focused on how do I make this military lifestyle work for me? What do I do? Is it possible to thrive as a military spouse? I know I want to use my skills to make income and impact, but it has to be sustainable. I don't want to burn myself out in the process. So how do I pursue my skills and my passions and still be present for and be the primary parent for my kids? So I was spending all this time trying to figure out, how do I make this work? And at the time I was reading a lot and I was trying all sorts of things to figure out how to find myself again. Now, the second thing that was going on in that time is that I started listening to podcasts on a much more regular basis, and in particular, business and marketing podcasts. And it was kind of funny because I didn't have a business at the time. I was a accidental stay-at-home mom, but it really was a game changer for me because it gave my mind something to focus on other than who needed a diaper change, other than who was crying or what mess had been made or who threw the Cheerios all across the floor when I had my back turned for literally 2 seconds. Listening to podcasts made me feel like myself again. And the third thing that was happening for me at the time is that I felt led to start a blog about my life as a military spouse. And I'm going to tell you how these 3 things came together. So fast forward 2 years, and I have learned that, number 1, it is possible to thrive as a military spouse and to find purpose despite our circumstances. I've learned through blogging that I was not alone in my struggle to find myself, to find purpose, to find my identity outside of just being a military spouse. And the third thing that I had learned in this time is that my next step was to start a podcast. I know how much listening to podcasts was impactful and meaningful to me, and I wanted to be that encouragement for other military spouses. So it took me about 9 months to get the podcast launched because I went from having the idea, but it was 2020 and we were in the middle of our first OCONUS PCS. That is our first overseas move, and I was trying to figure out, how do I help my now kindergartner navigate virtual school? We were trying to get settled into a new place where we were not actually supposed to have any physical contact with other people. So it took me a while from having the initial idea to actually getting it launched. But I kept plugging away during my free time, and I eventually launched the podcast. And now here we are, 3 years later, 199 episodes in. If you had asked me 3 years ago, I don't know what I expected, but 199 episodes seemed like a really big number. And the fact that I have maintained a weekly podcast for 3 whole years is amazing. And in some ways, it has far exceeded my expectations. And in other ways, I've learned a lot about what showing up consistently looks like over the long term, and how hard it can actually be to do that. Releasing a weekly podcast is no joke. Coming up with content to share with you each week, getting all of the pieces in place to make that happen takes time and energy. And there's something about launching something new. Like, there's this excitement, the newness of it, the unknown, the having so many different ideas and topics to talk about, that there's just something that's exciting about starting something new. But over time, that newness wears off. And this is where we hear so many people talk about the importance of consistency, because it's fun when it's new, but when that newness wears off, it really comes down to having a strong why, knowing what your reasons are for showing up and why it's important that you keep showing up. You keep going when it isn't as fresh or fun or new or exciting or as rewarding as it was in the beginning. And I hear so many coaches talk about the importance of consistency, of going until. But a lot of times we don't know what that until is. Until something changes, until we have a different why, until what? And that is the question that I have been mulling over for a while after 3 years of weekly podcast content. What is next? Am I still supposed to be showing up consistently in the same way, or is it time to make a change? And when I look at where I am in growing this podcast, in many ways, this podcast has been more successful than a lot of podcasts. And on the other hand, it's a niche podcast. It's not something that everyone is necessarily going to listen to. Unless you are a military spouse, it's not going to probably be your first choice of podcasts to listen to. But I truly am committed to empowering this community of military spouses. And so I have been sitting with the question for a while. Should the podcast continue? What is the next step for me? How can I continue to advocate for and support this community? Lately, I've been reading The Icarus Deception by Seth Godin, and one of the things he talks about in the book is the pursuit of art. And art is inherently vulnerable. It's not necessarily what we think of in terms of art is not just painting or drawing, but it's a unique work of a human being, a specific gift that you have to give to the world. In this case, a podcast is a form of art. And when it comes to art, there's not a specific path to follow to create great art. When we talk about living into your purpose, it is about doing something that is personally rewarding, that uses your passions and skills and that benefits others. So when it comes to producing art, when it comes to having that why, at the end of the day, it just comes down to taking that next right step that feels like the next right step for you, even when you don't know what the outcome will be. And 5 years ago, for me, that looked like feeling like I was supposed to start a blog about my journey as a military spouse. And 3 years ago, for me, that looked like deciding to turn that blog into a weekly podcast for military spouses. And I called it the Milspouse Mastermind Show based on what we were going to talk about. How do I use my skills and experiences to pursue something that I am passionate about without burning myself out in the process? A mastermind experience typically refers to a combination of brainstorming, education, peer accountability, and support. And that's really what I wanted to make this community about. And so that's where we started. And we've been doing this podcast, but over the last couple of years, I felt like it wasn't entirely clear. I wanted somebody that saw the podcast to have this immediate connection with, yes, this is what I am going to get from the podcast. And this idea of mastermind was still a little bit vague and uncertain. And I really wanted somebody to see that podcast and say, yes, this is for me. And so I am doing what feels like the next right step. And I don't know what the outcome will be. I don't know if this is what you need. I don't know if I will continue the podcast in the same way in the long term. But what I do know is that this feels like the next right step for right now. So what is happening is that the podcast will still be the podcast for you, but I am renaming the podcast. Now, the overarching brand is going to stay the same for right now. It is still going to be the Milspouse Mastermind brand. You can still go to milspousemastermind.com to find all of the resources and to click on the Work With Me link and find all of the resources that I have created to support you in your journey. But the podcast itself is going to have a new name. It is not going away. It will still be here, mostly in the same format. And it is still going to be about helping you find purpose, step into your potential as a military spouse, and to help you do it with more joy and less overwhelm. I have seen so many military spouse related podcasts come and go over the last few years. And I think it's really important to have this as a resource for you to help you tap into your potential as a military spouse and remind you of just how amazing you are, what you go through, and what you are capable of. So, is the Milspouse Mastermind Show going away? Yes, but the podcast is here to stay. And if you are dying to know what the new show will be called, stay tuned for the big reveal next week. I am so excited about this, so much so that we coincided the 200th episode of the podcast with the renaming of the podcast, and I'm launching a full mini series next week to help you reconnect with yourself, because I hear over and over again that so many military spouses struggle with identity and purpose, and I really want to tackle this topic in a little more detail about how we really begin to reconnect with ourselves. So next week is also Military Spouse Appreciation Week. I'm going to have some fun ways for us to connect in our Facebook community, and maybe even some giveaways. So if you are not already a part of that community, just come find us at milspousemastermind.com/community, or just click on the link in the show notes, and then come meet me back here next week to find out the big reveal of the new name of the show. Have an amazing week, friends. May you live filled, fueled, and full of joy. Hey friend, before you go, the Milspouse Mastermind community is here to help you thrive as a military spouse. Figure out what lights your heart on fire and equip you to create a life of impact. You can have an incredible impact simply by heading over to iTunes to subscribe and leave a review. And if today's episode was meaningful to you, I know it will be for others too. Spread the word by taking a screenshot of this episode and share it to your stories so we can continue to reach more people, change more lives, and shift the way that military spouses look at life. Because we are better together, and together we can change the world. Let's do it.